"Don't embarrass yourself," the Billionaire CEO said, her manicured hand hovering before pulling back. "Investors don't need grease stains near billion-dollar deals." He refused to shake the maintenance worker's hand in front of everyone. Said investors didn't need grease stains near billion-dollar deals and turned away while cameras flashed. The single dad didn't argue. He simply nodded and stepped aside. Minutes later, the entire building would depend on him. Because respect isn't measured by job titles. Before I show you the exact moment when the lockdown sealed every executive inside that glass tower, trapping the billionaire with the man she dismissed. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What unfolded that night wasn't really about a handshake. It was about who gets seen and who gets overlooked until everything falls apart. The applause resumed as if nothing had happened. Elias Mercer adjusted the cuff of his maintenance uniform, the fabric faintly smelling of machine oil and industrial cleaner. He didn't flinch, didn't defend himself, didn't even look offended. Calm sat on him the way the tool belt rested against his hip, natural, earned, unshaken. The executives nearby exchanged tight smiles, pretending not to notice. A few junior staff lowered their eyes. The chandelier above them shimmered in programmed patterns, light scattering across polished marble floors imported from somewhere that required a private jet. He simply stepped aside. That was his place in rooms like this, off to the edge, close enough to fix what broke, far enough to never belong. The gala filled the glass-walled lobby of Virelli Dynamics' headquarters, 70 stories of steel and mirrored confidence rising into the night sky. Waiters in tailored black carried trays of crystal glasses. A string quartet played near the grand staircase. Screens looped promotional footage of cybersecurity triumphs and corporate victories. Roland Virelli thrived in the center of it all. She wore authority like couture, sharp white suit, diamond cufflinks catching every flash of the cameras. Her voice carried easily over the hum of wealth, promising innovation, promising dominance, promising that her company's security systems were impenetrable. Elias had heard that word before. Impenetrable. He glanced toward the security dashboard embedded discreetly behind a decorative panel near the concierge desk. Most people didn't even realize it was there. But he knew every hidden conduit in this building, every service corridor, every override panel, every flaw. A faint amber flicker pulsed on one corner of the screen. Subtle. Almost shy. He noticed, across the lobby near a display table covered in robotics prototypes from sponsored public schools, his daughter stood straight-backed beside her project. Leela's dark hair was pulled into a neat braid. She wore her best cardigan, the one she insisted made her look professional. She'd watched the handshake refusal. He saw it in the way her small shoulders stiffened. Their eyes met. He gave her the smallest nod. It said, "I'm okay." It said, "We don't shrink." She nodded back, fiercer than her years. Near the champagne tower, a cluster of investors murmured approval as Roland launched into her keynote. She spoke about disruption, about market expansion, about how her systems had outperformed government models. Elias's gaze drifted again to that amber flicker. Then another, not enough for panic, just enough to whisper. He shifted slightly, stepping closer to the panel without drawing attention. The marble floor vibrated faintly underfoot, music, conversation, the steady mechanical rhythm of a building alive and proud of itself. He listened past it. There it was, a delay in the internal network handshake between two sub-level servers. Most wouldn't hear it. He did. Behind him, a junior executive laughed a little too loudly. Did you see her face when she pulled her hand back? God, that was brutal. Another voice replied, "Maintenance should stick to maintenance." Elias didn't turn. He let their words pass through him like static. Years ago, in another life, he'd sat in rooms with maps projected onto reinforced walls, tracking digital threats that didn't knock politely. He'd learned that arrogance was louder than warning signs. Roland's voice rose triumphantly. We don't just protect data, we define the future of security. The amber light blinked again, longer this time. His pulse didn't quicken, it steadied. Something in the system was testing the perimeter, not crashing it, testing. A reconnaissance probe disguised as routine traffic. Whoever designed it knew what they were doing. He scanned the room once more. Crystal glasses, silk gowns, diamond watches. A billionaire who wouldn't touch his hand, and a 10-year-old girl watching everything. He rested his palm lightly against the edge of the concealed console, feeling the faint warmth of circuitry beneath polished metal. The building breathed around him, unaware, for now. The building only whispered. Elias kept his hand near the concealed console as the amber flicker steadied into a rhythm. Not random, not harmless. A patterned pulse hidden beneath the gala's digital noise. He tracked it across the small diagnostic strip, eyes narrowing slightly while applause thundered for the CEO's closing line. Roland lifted a glass. To security without compromise, the crowd echoed her. He almost smiled at the irony. The pulse split into two channels. Someone wasn't knocking anymore. They were mapping. Across the lobby, Leela shifted beside her robotics display. The small-wheeled prototype she'd built for school blinked its own coded lights, programmed to navigate obstacles. She'd insisted he come tonight. Said it mattered that he see her presented in the same building where he worked nights fixing leaks and rewiring panels. He hadn't told her how strange it felt to stand in the polished version of the tower, the version most people saw. He moved casually along the perimeter, pretending to adjust a decorative lighting column while his eyes stayed locked on the service interface. The quartet transitioned into something brighter, violins rising. Waiters passed, laughter swelled, heels clicked on marble. Underneath it all, a subtle delay crept into the network latency graph. 3 milliseconds. Then, 7. He exhaled slowly. In another life, that kind of stagger preceded coordinated breaches against critical infrastructure overseas. Probes would test for response time, learn patterns, and then, when defenders relaxed, strike from multiple angles. He tapped a manual refresh command under the guise of checking light calibration. The interface resisted. That wasn't normal. A junior systems analyst rushed past him toward the executive control suite, tablet in hand, forehead creased. Elias caught a glimpse of cascading diagnostic warnings on the screen before the doors sealed behind her. So they'd seen it too. But they wouldn't understand it yet. He walked toward Lila. You okay? She asked quietly, eyes flicking once toward the stage where Roland now posed for photos. I'm fine, he said. Proud of you. She studied him the way only a child who knows her parent deeply can. You didn't even blink. Didn't need to. Her gaze dropped to her robot. Sometimes people think they're strong because they're loud. He crouched slightly to her height. Sometimes, a ripple of movement near the elevators caught his attention. One car paused between floors for half a second before resuming ascent. Most wouldn't notice. He did. The latency spike jumped again. 15 milliseconds. He straightened. Across the room, Roland's laughter rang bright as she clasped hands, other hands with donors. Cameras flashed. She hadn't spared him another glance. Fine. The building gave a faint tremor underfoot. Barely perceptible, like distant thunder rolling miles away. The analyst re-emerged from the control suite, now pale. She whispered urgently to another executive. Their heads turned toward the server corridor entrance. Elias felt it settle in his chest. There it is. A reconnaissance phase doesn't linger forever. He stepped closer to the service hallway just enough to hear muffled fragments as the executive door cracked open again. Unusual routing. External but masked. Why isn't the firewall? The door's shut. He inhaled, slow and controlled. Years of field operations had taught him that panic spreads faster than malware. Containment required clarity, precision, timing. Leela touched his sleeve. Dad? He softened instantly. Yeah, are you thinking about work? Always, he admitted gently. She glanced around at the glittering lobby. Does it ever bother you? That they don't see you? He followed her gaze. Crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, security badges clipped to lapels that never descended to sublevels. It used to, he said. Another tremor, slightly stronger. A soft electronic chime echoed from somewhere unseen. The amber pulse on the hidden console turned red for half a second, then back to amber. Testing response escalation. Whoever was behind this was patient. Rollin's voice carried again as she invited select guests to tour the executive command center. You'll see exactly why our architecture can't be breached. Elias almost laughed. He felt the shift in airflow first. The climate system compensated unexpectedly, pushing a colder draft down from overhead vents. Automated balancing. The building trying to stabilize something it didn't understand. Leela's robot suddenly froze mid-demo, wheels locking. That's weird, she murmured, kneeling to reset it. He knew that wasn't coincidence. The latency graph spiked to 22 milliseconds. Then, 30, somewhere deep below, a subsystem handshake failed to authenticate properly. A bead of condensation slid down the inside of the lobby's glass fade as outside wind pressed harder against 70 stories of engineered confidence. Elias's jaw tightened just slightly. He leaned toward his daughter. Listen to me carefully. If I tell you to stay close, you stay close. Okay? Her eyes widened, but she nodded. Okay. A faint alarm chirped once, then stopped. Conversation faltered for a fraction of a second before recovering. Roland raised an eyebrow toward her security chief. Elias looked up at the towering screens displaying the company logo. Impenetrable. The red pulse flickered again, longer this time. He didn't move yet. But he knew it was about to begin, and if it did, wealth wouldn't matter. Authority wouldn't matter. Only competence would. The red pulse returned. This time it didn't retreat back to amber. It was held. Across the lobby, conversation thinned into nervous fragments. Guests sensed something shifting, even if they couldn't name it. A violinist faltered mid-note before recovering, bow trembling slightly against string. The massive digital screens behind Roland flickered once, the company logo distorting for half a heartbeat before snapping back into pristine clarity. She didn't notice, or pretended not to. Ladies and gentlemen, she continued smoothly, gesturing toward the glass-walled executive command center above the lobby, you're about to see why our systems are 10 years ahead of anything on the market. Polite applause rippled outward. Elias felt the temperature drop another degree. That fact shouldn't have compensated that aggressively. Something was forcing resource allocation changes deep in the building's automation stack. A strain test. Pressure on infrastructure that was never meant to be stressed all at once. Near the elevators, a soft mechanical clunk echoed. One car stopped abruptly between floors. This time, several people noticed. A murmur spread. Roland's security chief pressed a finger to his earpiece. His expression tightened. He turned toward the command center doors, which slid open to admit two pale-faced analysts speaking in urgent whispers. Elias didn't need to hear them. He knew the pattern. Initial mapping, latency probing, elevator control handshake delay. Now escalation. The red pulse split across 3 nodes on the concealed console. Not random, coordinated. He stepped closer to the service panel again, shielding the movement behind a decorative pillar. His fingers hovered just short of manual override access. He wasn't authorized to interfere at this level, not officially. But he understood what they were looking at upstairs. A distributed injection attack masked inside encrypted internal traffic. Whoever engineered it wasn't brute forcing entry. They were leveraging trust relationships between subsystems, convincing the building to betray itself. Roland finally paused mid-sentence. A faint tremor shuddered through the marble floor. The lights dimmed, barely perceptible, but enough for the human eye to catch. The violinists stopped entirely. Silence pooled in the vast lobby. "What's happening?" Someone whispered. The command center doors burst fully open now. One analyst hurried toward Roland, tablet glowing with cascading alerts. "We're seeing irregular routing across sub-level servers," she said tightly. "It looks internal." "That's impossible," Roland replied, her voice still calm but sharpened. "Our internal architecture is segmented. It's bypassing segmentation." A beat. Another elevator clunked. Then all 4 visible cars froze simultaneously. Gasps erupted as indicator lights blinked red. Leela's small hand slid into her father's. He squeezed once. "Stay steady." High above, the massive glass fade shuddered as wind struck harder against it. The building groaned faintly, a low structural hum that most guests had never heard before because it usually hid beneath normal operational noise. Now the hum felt exposed. Roland straightened. "Initiate full system audit and lockdown protocol." The words echoed through hidden speakers. A mechanical sequence answered. Heavy security shutters began sliding down over lower-level exits. At first, guests assumed it was part of a demonstration, until the front doors sealed with a resonant metallic thud. The sound rolled through the lobby like distant thunder closing in. Murmurs turned into alarm. "Why are the doors closing? Is this part of the show?" The lighting flickered again, longer this time. Emergency strips along the floor glowed faintly, bathing the marble in a cold blue sheen. Upstairs, analysts scrambled across illuminated consoles. Elias felt it click into place. This wasn't random sabotage. It was timed. Timed to coincide with maximum visibility. Maximum ego. Maximum assumption of control. A message. The climate system whined as fans ramped unexpectedly, overcompensating for heat spikes somewhere below. Sublevel servers. If thermal loads surged unchecked, fail-safes would trip. If fail-safes tripped in sequence, he closed his eyes for half a second. Cascading shutdown. Or worse, Roland's security chief barked orders into his radio, override external connections. "Cut remote access. We already have," came the strained reply from upstairs. "It's propagating internally." Internally. The word landed like a verdict. Elias opened his eyes. The red pulse on the concealed console expanded across the diagnostic map, one node after another lighting up in synchronized rhythm. Whoever orchestrated this understood the building's blueprint intimately. He looked at the polished marble, at the crystal glasses trembling faintly on silver trays, at the 70 stories of curated dominance towering above them. All of it running on interconnected systems no one in a white suit truly respected. Until now. Roland turned slowly, scanning the lobby. Her gaze brushed past him once, dismissive even in crisis. "Get me my senior architect," she snapped. They're dialing in remotely. Now, another tremor hit, stronger. A sharp electronic tone pierced the air. Then the screens behind her went black. Total darkness swallowed the logo. Emergency lighting snapped fully on, casting long shadows across designer heels and tailored tuxedos. A collective intake of breath filled the space. Someone near the elevators pounded on metal doors from inside. Trapped. The building had sealed itself. And somewhere deep beneath the gala floor, a system Elias once studied in another life was being turned against its masters. He stepped forward slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to see the full diagnostic spread. 3 primary nodes compromised, thermal climb accelerating, manual reroute possible, but only from sublevel control. He looked down at Leela. She wasn't afraid. She was watching him. And upstairs, the billionaire who wouldn't touch his hand was learning what impenetrable really meant. The emergency lights hummed overhead, washing the marble lobby in a sterile blue glow. Somewhere above, a muffled alarm began to pulse, slow at first, then faster, like a heartbeat picking up speed. The pounding from the trapped elevator intensified. A woman's voice called out from inside, thin and sharp with panic. Rollins' composure thinned but didn't crack. "This is a controlled lockdown," she announced, projecting authority into the swelling chaos. "Please remain calm." Her security chief leaned close. "We've lost external network visibility. Internal routing tables are rewriting themselves." "That's not possible," she hissed. "Our segmentation prevents lateral movement." "It's not lateral," he replied. "It's systemic." Elias felt the word settle heavy in the air. Systemic meant the building itself was cooperating with the breach. A second alarm layered over the first, higher pitched. The FAC fans roared louder, forcing cold air downward as if trying to smother heat rising from unseen depths. Guests wrapped arms around themselves, confused by the sudden temperature shift. Leela stayed pressed against his side. "What's happening?" she asked softly. He crouched slightly, voice low and steady. "Someone's testing the building, pushing it. Can they break it?" "They're trying." Across the lobby, 2 analysts argued near the command center entrance. "Core server clusters overheating. Auto suppression won't engage without authentication. We're locked out of route." The words rippled outward, and this time people understood enough to be afraid. A heavy metallic clang echoed through the structure, deep, subterranean. That wasn't an elevator. That was a pressure valve. Elias's eyes flicked toward the far wall, where a decorative panel concealed vertical access shafts to the sublevels. Behind that polished fade ran power conduits, cooling lines, and fiber trunks that fed the entire tower. He could see it unfolding in his mind. The attack was forcing authentication loops between redundant systems. Each subsystem was waiting for confirmation from another compromised node. A perfect stalemate. A deadlock designed to drive thermal escalation. If heat climbed high enough, automatic containment would isolate floors. People would be trapped compartment by compartment. A child's cry pierced the lobby from near the staircase. Camilla Varelli stood frozen halfway up the steps, her phone useless in her hand. She looked younger without the armor of confidence she wore in photos. Human. Frightened, Rollins' head snapped toward her daughter. "Camilla, stay where you are." But even as she spoke, the staircase access doors above began sliding shut. The security chief swore under his breath. The building was partitioning itself. Elias rose fully now. He stepped toward the concealed console again and keyed in a local diagnostic shortcut only maintenance staff used during after-hours recalibration. The interface resisted for a split second, then yielded minimal read-only data. Enough. Thermal climb had accelerated to critical in sublevel 3. If the coolant pumps failed under authentication lock, the server cluster would cascade into emergency shutdown. That alone wouldn't destroy the building. But the real danger wasn't the servers. It was the backup generators. If load redistribution spiked uncontrollably, the lights flickered violently. Gasps erupted. Rollins turned sharply as she noticed him at the console. "What are you doing?" she demanded. He didn't look at her yet. "Checking something. This is restricted. So is 70 stories of infrastructure," he replied evenly. Another tremor rippled upward, stronger this time. A glass somewhere shattered, the sharp crack slicing through the noise. From the elevator shaft came a desperate banging. The analysts in the command center shouted over one another. Coolant loop unresponsive. It's spoofing sensor data. We can't isolate the infected node. Elias finally turned to face her. You don't have an external breach, he said calmly. It's internal trust exploitation. The system thinks it's talking to itself. Roland stared at him, disbelief flashing across her features. How would you know that? Because I've seen it before. He didn't say that part. Instead, he nodded subtly toward the ceiling. Your redundancy design relies on mutual authentication across 3 primary nodes. They're forcing a recursive handshake. It'll deadlock thermal controls. Her security chief looked between them. Is that accurate? An analyst above shouted, We're seeing recursive loops. Yes. Silence hung for half a breath. Roland's jaw tightened. Fine, then fix it. I can't from here, he said. Another metallic boom rolled upward from below. The emergency lights flickered again, longer, more violently. Camilla's voice trembled from the staircase. Mom. Roland's composure cracked for the first time. What do you need? She asked him, the edge gone from her tone. He held her gaze steadily. Access to sublevel control, he said. Manual reroute. The words landed heavy. That area is restricted to maintenance, her security chief muttered. Exactly, Elias replied. Above them, a sharp warning tone shifted into a continuous alarm. Thermal threshold nearing critical. The building groaned again, louder now, as if protesting the strain. Leela squeezed his hand once more. He felt her trust in that small gesture. Roland hesitated only a second longer. Then she nodded. Take him, she ordered the security chief. And for the first time that night, the billionaire who wouldn't shake his hand stepped aside so he could pass. The shift was subtle, but everyone saw it. He moved quickly, not rushing, just precise. The security chief fell into step beside him as they crossed the trembling lobby toward the concealed service corridor. Emergency lights cast long shadows behind them. Somewhere above, metal strained with a low, groaning hum. Sublevel 3 is where your primary cooling loop feeds the server core, he said calmly. If the recursive handshake keeps blocking authentication, coolant pumps won't cycle properly. The security chief swallowed. Our architects are trying to isolate it remotely. That won't work, Elias replied. The attack's leveraging internal trust architecture. Remote commands are part of the infected chain. Roland followed close behind despite her heels slipping slightly on polished marble. Pride had been replaced by urgency. What exactly is happening? She demanded. He didn't slow. Someone studied your blueprint. They're forcing each node to wait on confirmation from another compromised node. It's not brute force, it's patience. They reached the service door. The chief keyed his badge. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the lock disengaged. The hallway beyond smelled faintly of ozone and chilled air. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The noise of the gala faded behind thick concrete walls, replaced by the deeper mechanical heartbeat of the tower. Leela caught his sleeve before he stepped through. Dad, he knelt slightly despite the urgency. Her eyes searched his face. You're not doing this because of her. He understood what she meant. No, he said softly. I'm doing it because it's right. She nodded once, steady. Roland watched that exchange in silence. For a moment, the weight of what she'd dismissed earlier pressed visibly against her composure. The security chief motioned forward. We need to move. They descended the narrow stairwell. The temperature climbed with each level. Vibrations pulsed faintly through the concrete underfoot, thermal strain increasing below. Midway down, the overhead lights flickered harder, then steadied. Roland's phone buzzed uselessly in her hand. External investors are already messaging, she muttered. Our stock. Won't matter if your generators spike, he interrupted gently. She fell silent. On the landing before Sublevel 3, he stopped abruptly. The air felt wrong, too warm. He pressed his palm against the metal door. Heat. The security chief swore under his breath. Coolant loops already destabilizing, Elias said. If backup generators kick into compensation mode without thermal regulation, you'll overload the transfer switch. Rollins stared at him. How do you know that? He exhaled slowly. Because I've seen coordinated infrastructure attacks before. The words hung there. Her eyes narrowed. Where? In places where mistakes cost more than stock prices, the chief opened the door. A wave of hot air hit them immediately. Inside, the sublevel control chamber glowed in emergency red. Racks of servers hummed violently. Cooling fans whined at maximum speed, fighting a losing battle. Warning lights flashed across panels like a storm of signals begging for human intervention. Above the central console, a digital readout climbed toward critical threshold. Auto-suppression? The chief asked. Locked behind authentication loop, Elias replied. The system doesn't trust itself anymore. He stepped toward the primary control board. Manual override access sat beneath a reinforced cover, maintenance-only protocol. Most executives had never seen it. Rollins' gaze tracked his hands carefully now, not dismissive, not superior, watching. The floor vibrated harder. A loud metallic crack echoed from somewhere deeper within the mechanical shaft. That's a pressure valve straining, he said. We don't have much time. He flipped open the reinforced cover and began entering a sequence from memory, bypassing automated trust verification and forcing direct mechanical command routing. The interface flashed red. Access denied. He adjusted the sequence. Tried again. Denied. They're spoofing local credentials too, he muttered. Rollins stepped closer despite the heat. What do you need? Physical isolation, he replied immediately. We separate Node 3 from the loop manually. Cut its handshake entirely. That could shut down half the building. If we don't, the building will shut itself down. The security chief looked between them. Make the call. Rollins hesitated, only a fraction of a second. Then she nodded. Do it. He moved to the mechanical isolation panel on the far wall. The air burned hotter there, sweat forming along his collar despite his steady breathing. His fingers found the emergency bypass latch. It required force. He braced himself and pulled. Metal resisted. Then gave with a violent snap. The room plunged into momentary darkness before emergency strips reignited. Server noise dropped by a fraction. The thermal readout slowed, but didn't stop climbing. Node 3 isolated, he said, breathing controlled. But the cascade's already in motion. Rollins' voice lowered. Can you stop it? He looked at the rising numbers. Yes, he said quietly. Then he added, but you're not going to like how. And somewhere above them, 70 stories of curated power waited to see whether the man she refused to touch could save it. The thermal readout slowed, but only slightly. The numbers were still climbing, just less violently now. Fans screamed overhead, pushing superheated air through ducts that weren't designed for this kind of strain. Rollins stepped closer, the sharp lines of her white suit now creased with sweat. What don't I like? She asked, her voice tight but steady. He wiped his palm on his uniform before answering. Your architecture prioritizes redundancy over isolation. That's great for performance, not for containment. To stop the cascade, I'll have to manually break the trust chain across the remaining nodes. Her brow furrowed. Break it how? By shutting down your executive command privileges. The security chief inhaled sharply. Rollins didn't speak for a full second. Above them, a violent tremor shook dust loose from the ceiling. Somewhere deeper in the structure, a metallic bang echoed like a warning shot. If you cut executive command, she said carefully, I lose full visibility. You already have, he replied. Right now, your credentials are part of the infected loop. The system trusts you too much. The irony landed heavy between them. Another spike flashed across the screen, temperature nearing critical threshold again. He didn't wait for her answer. He moved back to the central console and pulled open a secondary maintenance panel rarely accessed outside disaster drills. A manual segmentation array blinked faintly beneath the surface. This bypass was designed for wartime infrastructure failure, he said quietly, almost to himself. Roland heard it. Wartime? She repeated. He didn't elaborate. His fingers moved with calm efficiency, navigating layers of hardware override rather than software commands. He bypassed authentication entirely, rerouting power through direct mechanical switches embedded beneath the digital system. The interface flickered wildly. Access conflict. He forced it again. Across the chamber, one entire server rack powered down abruptly, plunging that section into shadow. The hum of fans shifted in pitch. Upstairs, faintly through the ceiling, they heard a ripple of startled voices. The security chief pressed a hand to his earpiece. Lobby lights just dimmed further. Elevators fully offline. Good, Elias muttered. Less load. Rollins stared at him. You're comfortable with this? He didn't look up. I'm familiar with it. Another tremor rolled through the sublevel, stronger this time. The floor vibrated under their boots. Warning alarms escalated from pulsing tones to a continuous shriek. The thermal readout froze for half a second, then dropped 2 degrees, not much, but enough to prove it was working. Roland let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He moved to the final isolation lever, a heavy mechanical bar that physically severed the recursive handshake between Node 1 and Node 2. It required both hands. If I pull this, he said, glancing at her, your live market feeds upstairs go dark. Completely. She hesitated. Investors, cameras, reputation. Then another metallic crack boomed through the structure, louder than the others. Her daughter was still upstairs. Pull it, she said. He did. The lever resisted with grinding force before slamming downward into locked position. Sparks flashed briefly from an adjacent panel. The chamber lights flickered again, then steadied. The server hum softened. The thermal readout began to fall steadily now. 5 degrees. 7. 10. The continuous alarm downgraded to a slower pulse. The security chief spoke into his radio, temperature stabilizing in sublevel 3. Cascade slowing. Upstairs, faint cheers drifted through concrete and steel. Roland sagged back against the console for a brief second, relief flooding her face before she regained composure. Is it over? She asked. He watched the diagnostic map carefully. The red pulses that had spread across the nodes were fading, one by one reverting to steady green. Almost, he said. A final surge flashed across the screen, an automated retaliation attempt by the breach, trying to re-establish the trust loop. He anticipated it. Before the system could re-authenticate, he manually locked the segmentation array into physical isolation mode. The breach hit the wall he'd built and dissipated. The red vanished entirely. Only green remained. The chamber fell into a strange, ringing quiet as alarms powered down. The load-vac fans gradually slowed from a scream to a steady whir. Rollins' security chief exhaled audibly. It's contained. He stepped back from the console slowly, shoulders rising and falling once before settling. It'll hold, he confirmed. Above them, lights in the lobby flickered back toward full brightness. Through the ceiling, applause began, not the polite kind from earlier. Something raw, relieved. Rollins studied him in silence. You said wartime infrastructure failure, she murmured. He met her gaze evenly. You built a fortress, he said. But you forgot the difference between strength and resilience. She absorbed that. And for the first time since the gala began, she looked not at his uniform, but at him. Upstairs, 70 stories of power were learning who had really been holding them up all along. The applause filtered faintly through concrete and steel, muffled but unmistakable. It wasn't for a keynote this time. It wasn't for a quarterly projection or a stock surge. It was a relief. Roland straightened from the console, regaining the posture she wore like armor. But something in her eyes had shifted. Not a weakness. Not surrender. Recognition. "Walk me through it," she said quietly. All of it. The security chief looked between them, surprised by the tone. It wasn't a command. It was a request. Elias wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. The sublevel air still felt thick, metallic, charged with the aftermath of near failure. It wasn't random, he said. The breach was designed to exploit trust hierarchies. Your architecture assumes internal nodes are allies. It weaponized that assumption. Roland folded her arms not defensively, but to steady herself. We invested billions into that architecture, I know. She narrowed her eyes slightly. You keep saying that. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward a secondary diagnostic display and pulled up the breach signature that remained in residual memory. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, fractured but decipherable. This pattern, he said pointing, isn't public. It was used in targeted infrastructure tests overseas. Coordinated simulation attacks. Meant to expose systemic blind spots, the security chief blinked. Simulation? He nodded once. The kind you don't read about in tech journals. Roland's gaze sharpened. You weren't always maintenance. It wasn't a question. He leaned against the console lightly, posture still calm. No. Silence settled between them again, heavy but no longer hostile. Above, the elevator banging had stopped. Systems were rebooting floor by floor now, carefully under the segmentation lock he'd enforced. The building felt steadier beneath their feet. Roland looked toward the stairwell door leading back up to the lobby. My daughter, she said, more to herself than to him. She's fine, he replied. Partition protocols isolated upper floors safely once thermal stabilized. Her shoulders lowered slightly at that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The security chief's radio crackled. Lobby stabilized. Guests shaken but safe. Investors asking what happened. Roland let out a slow breath. They'll want a narrative, she murmured. They'll get the truth, Elias said evenly. Her eyes flicked to his. The truth, she repeated. He didn't flinch. Your system wasn't impenetrable. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. I'm aware. Footsteps pounded down the stairwell then, lighter, hurried. Lila appeared at the doorway, breathless but steady. She'd convinced someone upstairs to let her through. Dad? He crossed the room in 2 strides and crouched as she wrapped her arms around him. The tension he'd held inside since the first red pulse finally loosened at that contact. You did it, she whispered. We did, he corrected softly. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. You didn't even care what she said earlier. He glanced briefly toward Roland, who stood a few feet away, watching the exchange in silence. It wasn't about that, he said. Leela studied him carefully, as if weighing something deeper. Then she said it, clear, simple, unshaken. Doing the right thing doesn't depend on who respects you. The words settled into the air like something permanent. Roland heard them. The security chief heard them. Even the hum of machinery seemed to pause around that sentence. He smiled faintly at his daughter. You've been listening. I always do. He stood slowly, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Roland approached them, heels quieter now against concrete. She stopped a respectful distance away. "I owe you both an apology," she said. The words were measured, controlled, but genuine. "To you," she added, looking at him directly, "for earlier." Leela squeezed his hand gently. He met Roland's gaze without triumph, without bitterness. "Tonight wasn't about pride," he said. "It was about preventing something worse. I understand that now." Another silence. But this one felt different, not strained, transformed. The security chief cleared his throat. "Press is already gathering outside," word spreading. Roland nodded once. "Prepare a statement." She hesitated, then looked back at Elias. "Will you stand beside me when I give it?" The question carried weight, not as a favor, as acknowledgement. He considered it. Upstairs, the lobby where she had refused his hand was filling with relieved voices and stunned investors, witnesses to both humiliation and salvation. Public memory was forming in real time. He glanced down at Leela. She gave the smallest nod. He looked back at Roland. "Yes," he said. And together they turned toward the stairwell, toward the place where power had been tested and dignity had quietly prevailed. The climb back to the lobby felt different. The air grew cooler with each level, but the tension hadn't vanished. It had shifted, condensed into anticipation. Above them, voices overlapped in anxious clusters. Phones lit up faces. Security personnel moved with controlled urgency. When they emerged into the lobby, the scene looked nothing like the polished celebration from earlier. Crystal glasses lay abandoned on tables. The quartet sat silent, instruments resting in laps. Investors who had once laughed beneath chandeliers now stood in wrinkled suits, eyes scanning for reassurance. Every gaze turned toward Roland, and then, almost reluctantly, toward him. Emergency lights had given way to partial restoration. The massive screens behind the stage were still dark, reflecting the crowd like a mirror instead of projecting confidence. The same marble floor where she had refused his handshake now carried the echo of their footsteps side by side. Roland stepped forward first. "My friends," she began, voice steady but stripped of theatrical warmth. "Tonight we experienced a coordinated internal systems breach." A ripple passed through the room. She didn't soften it, didn't spin it. Our architecture was exploited through recursive trust manipulation. It was not impenetrable. Murmurs swelled. He stood slightly behind her, not hidden, not centered. Present. "The breach has been contained," she continued, "because someone in this building recognized what others did not." She turned slightly toward him. Cameras pivoted. Lenses zoomed. The room followed. This building stands because of his intervention. No embellishment. No corporate polish. Just truth. The security chief gestured subtly toward the central console display in the lobby, now projecting a simplified diagram of the segmentation he'd enforced. Guests could see the before and after, red collapsing into green. Proof. Roland extended her hand. This time there was no hesitation. The entire lobby watched. For a fraction of a second, the memory of earlier hovered between them. Then, he took her hand. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Not for spectacle, but for survival. Cameras captured it from every angle. The refused handshake replaced by one freely given. The narrative shifting in real time. If you're still here watching this unfold, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this remind us who really holds the line when everything shakes. The words weren't spoken aloud in the lobby, but they hung in the moment itself. Roland released his hand but didn't step away. "Our investigation will be transparent," she said, "and our architecture will be redesigned, with resilience prioritized over pride." She paused. "And effective immediately, operational authority structures will include infrastructure leads at every level." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Investors exchanged looks. But no one argued. They had all heard the alarms. They had all felt the tremors. And they had all watched who walked into the fire without needing applause. Camilla descended the staircase slowly and crossed the marble floor toward them. She stopped beside her mother, then looked at him. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once. "You're welcome." Leela stood a few steps away, chin lifted slightly, not smug, not triumphant. Just certain. The massive lobby screens flickered back to life behind them. Not with branding. Not with stock metrics. But with a live thermal stabilization graph settling into steady green. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Roland faced the press cameras now gathering near the entrance. "I misjudged someone tonight," she said clearly. "That won't happen again." The honesty in that admission carried more weight than any marketing campaign ever could. Around them, employees in maintenance uniforms, security jackets, catering aprons, people who usually blended into the background, stood a little straighter. Something had shifted beyond one crisis. Public exposure had done its work. Not humiliation. Correction. He felt Leela slip her hand into his again. "You didn't even raise your voice," she murmured. He smiled faintly. Didn't need to. Across the lobby, executives who had laughed earlier avoided his eyes now, not out of fear, but awareness. The building hummed steadily again, systems balanced, segmented, resilient. For the first time that night it felt honest. Roland leaned slightly toward him without breaking her posture for the cameras. "I'd like you to consult on the redesign," she said under her breath. He didn't answer immediately. The applause still echoed. The handshake still lingered in memory. The tower still stood because someone who was never meant to lead it knew exactly how it worked. And for once, everyone knew it too. The applause tapered into scattered conversations, but the energy in the lobby didn't return to its earlier glittering arrogance. It has changed temperature, warmer in some places, humbler in others. Investors clustered near the stage, speaking in low, urgent tones. Analysts replayed fragments of system logs on tablets, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and reluctant admiration. Maintenance staff who had been instructed to stay invisible during the gala now stood openly along the perimeter, no longer pretending not to exist. Elias felt Leela's hand still wrapped around his. "You okay?" he asked her quietly. She nodded. "You were calm the whole time." "I wasn't calm," he admitted. "I was focused." She smiled faintly. "That's better." Across the room, Roland conferred with her executive team. There was no raised voice now, no sharp dismissal. Her gestures were measured, deliberate. Twice, she glanced toward him, not to command, not to correct, but to include. The press had been allowed inside in controlled waves. Cameras remained trained on the central floor, hungry for narrative. A breach at a cybersecurity giant during a live gala was already trending. The difference was that the ending wasn't scandal. It was exposure. The chief of security approached him again. "We're running a deep scan across all nodes," he said. "Your segmentation lock is holding. No reinfection attempts." "Good," Elias replied. "Don't remove the physical isolation until you've rebuilt authentication chains from scratch. Not patched, rebuilt." The man nodded without argument. That, too, was new. Camilla stepped closer to Leela, studying her with open curiosity. "Your robot froze earlier," she said softly. "Yeah," Leela replied. "It depends on stable signals." Camilla glanced around the towering lobby. "Guess everything does." The girls shared a small, knowing look that didn't belong to billion-dollar valuations or boardroom hierarchies. Just understanding. Roland approached again, this time without cameras hovering inches away. "The board is convening an emergency session tomorrow morning," she said. "I want you there." He met her gaze evenly. As maintenance? As infrastructure authority, the words carried weight. She continued, quieter now. The vulnerability you described, trust exploitation, we dismissed similar recommendations 3 years ago. Called them excessive, he didn't say I know. Instead, he asked, why? Cost. Complexity. Optics. She didn't hide behind corporate phrasing. Resilience doesn't sell as well as dominance. He studied her face carefully. And now? Now I've seen what dominance looks like when it fails. A faint hum rippled through the building as additional systems rebooted successfully. Elevators chimed one by one, returning to service. Guests began retrieving coats. The gala was over, even if no one formally declared it. The narrative had shifted too dramatically for champagne. Roland extended a tablet toward him. Preliminary data capture of the breach signature. I'd like your analysis before sunrise. He accepted it without ceremony. No one gasped this time at the sight of her handing him something important. No one laughed. Public memory had rewritten the hierarchy. Lila tugged gently at his sleeve. Are we staying? He looked down at her. The fatigue in her eyes was finally visible now that adrenaline had faded. Not long. Roland noticed the exchange. There's a car waiting, she offered. I'll have you both driven home. He considered refusing on principle. But this wasn't about pride anymore. That would help, he said simply. Outside the glass fade, city lights glittered across the skyline. News vans were already gathering at the perimeter gates. The world would wake to headlines about the breach. But inside the lobby, something quieter had already taken root. Maintenance staff were speaking to executives without lowered eyes. Analysts were asking questions instead of defending ego. Even the security chief had repositioned his stance, less command, more collaboration. Poetic justice didn't roar, it recalibrated. Roland turned toward the remaining press cluster. One more statement, she announced. Cameras lifted again. She gestured for him to stand beside her. This time, he didn't hesitate. The failure tonight was not technological alone, she said clearly. It was structural, in how we assign authority. That changes now. The words echoed through marble and glass, and I intend to ensure the people who understand our infrastructure best are never sidelined again. She didn't look at him for approval. She didn't need to. The handshake earlier had already done its work. As the cameras flashed one last time, he felt Leela's head lean gently against his arm. You didn't let it make you smaller, she whispered. He looked out at the towering glass walls that had once reflected only wealth. No, he said quietly, I didn't. And in the reflection now, everyone could see why. The lobby had thinned to a controlled bustle. Investors departed in tight-lipped groups. Analysts moved with purpose instead of panic. The string quartet quietly packed their instruments, their earlier melodies replaced by the soft click of latches closing. Roland lowered her hand from the final press statement and stepped aside as security began guiding media crews toward the exit. The glass fade reflected flashing lights from news vans gathering beyond the gates. Inside, the air felt steadier, not celebratory. Reset. He stood near the central console reviewing the breach signature on the tablet she'd handed him. Even stripped down to preliminary logs, the architecture of the attack was elegant, precise trust manipulation embedded in legitimate internal requests. Whoever had engineered it knew how to move like a ghost inside systems that believed they were safe. Roland approached again. No cameras now. Just the quiet hum of restored infrastructure behind them. Walk me through what we missed, she said. He angled the tablet so she could see. 3 years ago, you deprioritized physical segmentation redundancy. You relied on layered software trust. She nodded once. We did. That created efficiency, he continued, but it also created a single philosophical flaw. You believed internal meant secure. Her jaw tightened slightly. That's not naive. It's industry standard. It is, he agreed. And that's the problem. She absorbed that without defensiveness. Across the lobby, Camilla and Leela sat side by side on the edge of the stage platform, speaking quietly about robotics. Their earlier fear had faded into cautious curiosity. Roland followed his gaze toward them. When the elevator stopped, she said softly, "I couldn't reach her." He remembered the crack in her voice then. "Power doesn't override physics," he replied. "Not when systems turn inward." She looked back at him. "You've seen that before," he considered how much to say. "In another life, I specialized in defending critical infrastructure from coordinated hybrid attacks, power grids, transport hubs, medical systems." Her eyes sharpened with recognition. "Military." He didn't confirm it directly. "I left when Leela was born," he said instead. "Stability mattered more, and you chose maintenance?" "I chose proximity." She studied him carefully. "You wanted to understand how civilian systems were actually built." A faint smile touched his expression. "Most people don't look below the marble." A short, humorless breath escaped her. "I didn't." The security chief approached with updated metrics. Full thermal stabilization confirmed. No reinfection attempts. Forensics teams are isolating entry vectors. Roland nodded. "And executive override privileges?" "Temporarily suspended pending rebuild." She glanced at Elias. He gave a small approving nod. The chief hesitated, then added, "Board members are requesting immediate reassurances." "Tell them the truth," she said, "and tell them we're restructuring authority." The man blinked but complied. Silence settled briefly between them again. Then she asked, "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" "Before tonight." He didn't need clarification. About the vulnerability, about the handshake, about any of it. "I wasn't asked," he said simply. The answer landed heavier than accusation ever could. Across the lobby, maintenance staff began discreetly resetting decorative panels. Waiters cleared abandoned glasses. The building was returning to function, but it felt different now, as if some invisible layer had been peeled back. Roland extended her hand again, not for cameras this time, just between them. "Consult with us," she said. Not as a gesture, as authority. He looked at her hand. Earlier that night, she had withdrawn it. Now it remained steady, offered without spectacle. "I'll consult," he said after a beat. "On one condition." Her brow lifted slightly. "Name it. Infrastructure decisions include people who work inside it every day. Not just those who present it." She didn't hesitate. "Agreed." They shook again. No applause, no flashes, just agreement. From the stage, Leela laughed softly at something Camilla said. The sound carried clearly across the marble floor. Roland turned toward her daughter, something thoughtful in her expression. "Children notice more than we think," she murmured. "They always do," he replied. Outside, the city skyline glittered, unchanged, indifferent to what had almost happened inside the tower. But within those 70 stories, authority had been recalibrated. Not destroyed, rebalanced. And as the final guests stepped into waiting cars, the reflection in the glass no longer showed just wealth. It showed resilience, earned, not assumed. The lobby doors finally unlocked with a heavy mechanical click, allowing the first wave of press and emergency personnel to step fully inside. Flashbulbs ignited again, but the frenzy had softened into something more measured. The crisis had passed. Now the world wanted meaning. Roland stood at the center of the marble floor. No podium this time, no choreographed lighting, just restored overhead fixtures and the faint scent of overheated circuitry still lingering in the air. He remained beside her, Not as an accessory, not as a background. Equal height, equal presence. The breach exploited an internal trust vulnerability, she stated clearly for the cameras, and it was resolved through decisive physical segmentation led by infrastructure authority. She didn't say his job title. She didn't minimize it either. A reporter raised a hand. Are you confirming that the executive command failed to contain the incident? Yes, she replied without hesitation. Remote command privileges were part of the vulnerability chain. They were disabled to stop the cascade. Murmurs rippled through the press cluster. Another reporter leaned forward. And who made that call? Rolland didn't look at her security chief. She didn't deflect to a board member. She turned slightly toward him. He did. The weight of public acknowledgement settled across the room. Cameras shifted again. He felt the focus, but it didn't rattle him. The marble beneath his boots felt steady now. The building hummed in balanced rhythm, no longer straining. A journalist squinted at her notes. Earlier tonight, there were reports of a tense exchange between you and maintenance staff. The word lingered, cautious. Rolland didn't retreat from it. There was, she said, and I misjudged him. Silence. The admission carried further than any defensive explanation could have. Infrastructure doesn't care about ego, she continued. And tonight reminded me of that. The honesty landed with a kind of quiet force. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't embellish. Public exposure didn't require humiliation. It required truth. Near the stage, maintenance workers stood a little closer now, no longer orbiting the walls. One of them, older, hands rough from decades of labor, met his gaze and gave the smallest nod of respect. He returned it. A final question cut through the cluster. Will there be internal restructuring? Yes, Rolland answered. Operational and infrastructure authority will be redefined. Physical systems oversight will no longer be subordinate to executive optics. That phrase, executive optics, hung heavy. The same optics that had once pulled her hand back. Now reshaped in front of witnesses. When the press conference concluded, security guided reporters toward designated briefing areas. The crowd thinned again, leaving only staff and a few board members who had remained through the aftermath. Rolland turned toward him one last time before dispersing. Tomorrow morning, she said quietly, I want you presenting to the board. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Presenting? You understand the flaw better than any architect on payroll. He considered the irony. Maintenance uniform, boardroom table, same building, different posture. I'll be there, he said. She hesitated, then added, I won't forget what you did. He met her gaze steadily. It wasn't for you. A faint, almost humbled smile crossed her face. I know. Across the lobby, Leela stood waiting patiently, her small hand tucked into the strap of her bag. Camilla lingered beside her, no longer the untouchable daughter of a billionaire, just another kid who'd felt a building shake. Ready? He asked as he approached. Leela nodded. Yeah, Camilla glanced at her mother. Rolland gave a small approving gesture. Thank you, Camilla said again, this time more confidently. He inclined his head. Take care of each other. The girls exchanged a look that promised future conversations outside of gala lights and crisis alarms. As they walked toward the exit, maintenance staff parted not out of hierarchy, but acknowledgement. The same marble floor where he had been dismissed now carried his steps with quiet authority. At the threshold, he paused. The night air outside felt cooler, cleaner. News vans idled along the curb. Flashing lights reflected off the glass fade that had once mirrored only prestige. Now it reflected something else. Accountability. Leela slipped her hand into his again as they approached the waiting car. You think she meant it? She asked softly. Yes, he said after a moment. I think she did. Behind them, through 70 stories of glass and steel, power had been corrected, not crushed, not conquered, just reminded. And that reminder had been witnessed by everyone who mattered. The car door closed with a soft, insulated thud, sealing out the hum of reporters and idling engines. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, the tower rose behind them, glass catching city lights, no longer gleaming with untouchable arrogance, but standing quiet, almost reflective. Leela leaned her head against the window, watching the building shrink in the distance. It looks different now, she murmured. It's the same building, he said gently. She shook her head. No. People see it differently. He couldn't argue with that. Inside the car, his maintenance uniform still carried the scent of heat and circuitry. His hands were faintly nicked from the isolation lever. The adrenaline had finally faded, leaving behind a deep, steady exhaustion. But not regret. His phone vibrated softly. A message from an unknown number. Board Chair, we look forward to your presentation tomorrow. Infrastructure Authority will be restructured effective immediately. He stared at the screen for a long second before locking it again. Leela tilted her head. Was that her? No, he replied. It was someone who finally understands. The city blurred past in streaks of red and white light. Somewhere behind them, investors were rewriting forecasts. Analysts were rebuilding trust chains. Executives were reconsidering policies that once seemed untouchable. He wasn't thinking about the boardroom. He was thinking about the handshake. About the moment a hand had been pulled back because of oil stains. And the moment that same hand had been extended again, not for optics, not for cameras, but because it had to be. Poetic justice didn't demand humiliation in return. It demanded balance. The car slowed at a red light. Reflections of skyscrapers shimmered across the windshield like fractured mirrors. Dad? Leela said quietly. Yeah? When she said sorry, you didn't look angry, he considered that. I wasn't, he said. Anger would have made it about me. And it wasn't? No. He glanced at her. It was about making sure you grow up in a world where people don't confuse titles with value. She smiled faintly, satisfied. The light turned green. By the time they reached their modest apartment building, the tower downtown had already begun trending across every major news outlet. Headlines scrolled, security giant breach averted by infrastructure tech. CEO admits structural failure. Internal authority shift announced. He stepped out of the car and looked up at the familiar brick fade of home. No marble, no chandeliers, just steady ground and warm windows. Leela hopped out beside him. You're going to that board meeting, she said confidently. Yes. In your uniform? He smiled slightly. Probably, she grinned. Good. Inside, the apartment felt small and honest. He set his tool belt down on the kitchen counter, the metal buckle clinking softly against laminate. Familiar sounds, familiar smells. No applause here, no cameras, just quiet. He poured 2 glasses of water, handed one to her. You know, she said thoughtfully, if you'd gotten mad earlier, none of that would have happened. He nodded once. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay steady. She took a sip, then asked, Are you going to fix their whole system now? He leaned back against the counter, thinking of the segmentation array, the flawed trust architecture, the boardroom waiting for him. I'm going to help them build it better, he said. Not because they deserved it, because people inside those 70 stories deserved to be safe, because Camilla had stood frozen on a staircase, because systems that hold communities together shouldn't collapse under pride. The apartment clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, sirens wailed faintly somewhere in the city, life continuing, crises unfolding in other corners of the night. He crouched slightly so he was eye level with Leela. Remember what you said down there? he asked. She tilted her head. About doing the right thing? He nodded. That's going to matter more than any title, he said. She smiled. Across town, the tower still stood tall against the skyline. But now, inside its glass and steel, authority had been reshaped by someone who once stood in the margins. Someone whose handshake had been refused, and whose steady hands had held the building together anyway. If this story moved you, ask me for the next story title and let's build another one together. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, The Mayor Mocked the Street Sweeper Until the Storm Proved Him Wrong. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?